It was Ptolemy of Alexandria that gave the world astronomy and very largely contributed to the rise of astrology. There were zoological gardens. There were ponds for fish. There were reserves to protect animals. There was just about anything and everything you can think of. And not far outside of the boundaries of Alexandria stood the great group of pyramids, which have remained to this time the wonders of the world. Very little is actually known about the pyramids. Contemporary records are very scanty. They are mentioned by Herodotus in the 5th century BC. But for the most part, no one has had an interest deep enough to attempt to investigate the circumstances surrounding the building of these great monuments. To this day, we really do not know why they were built, when they were built, and how it has happened that they have continued to intrigue human thinking for so long a period of time. Perhaps the most simple beginning for the search for pyramids is to realize that the pyramid builders represent a period in the development of human society. Pyramids were built in many different places. Probably one of the most interesting groups right here on the Western Hemisphere, the pyramid towers and temples of the Aztec and Maya culture. A few years ago, enormous pyramids were discovered in central China. And we know that the ziggurats of Babylon and Chaldea were all part of this great pyramid building scheme of things. The shape of the pyramid changed considerably in the course of time. In the beginning, it was a mound, and the very earliest examples still had the mound form, and these are still found in the great monuments in Java, the Borobudur, which is probably one of the most powerful and fascinating religious monuments now surviving, the Shwe Dagon in Rangoon, the great cities of the Khmer culture of Indochina, Cambodia, and Laos. All of these have pyramid structures peculiar to them. Pyramids appear, foreshortened or otherwise, also in graphic art, and among the mandalas of Tibet, Mongolia, Bhutan, Korea, China, and Japan. The pyramid design occurs frequently and represents a basis of a great meditation picture. This has led some scholars to assume that the pyramids were meditation symbols, that they were created for the purpose of reminding the individual that there was a mysterious reality underlying all the temporal and changeable patterns of mankind. In the Asclepian dialogue, Hermes describes the fact that in a sense these buildings were memorials to the divine power. They bore witness to those times and those thoughts when the gods walked with men. They became part of a traditional heritage. And if we study Neoplatonism, we will come to the conclusion that the gods who walked with men were actually the gods in men, that it was a divine level of insight which resulted in the great architectural feedback which we know as the pyramids. Actually, the circumstances around them challenge our imagination. We know that whoever built the Great Pyramid of Giza was well acquainted with astronomy, that he had a very complete knowledge of the solar system and all of the wonders of the cosmic plan as revealed through the bodies and objects moving in the heavens. He knew the distances between the Earth and the other planets of the solar system. He knew the precession of the equinoxes. He realized the importance of the star groups. He already knew the decans and dodecanates of the zodiac. These things just do not fit into the general concept that we have of the state of the world when the pyramid was presumed to have been built. The only possible answer is, on this level, that at the time the pyramid builders labored, they had a knowledge among themselves that had not been distributed to the people. Even the rulers did not possess this knowledge. And that there was a cult or sect of architects and artificers, the builders of monuments, who knew the proportions and mathematics and had deeply imbibed from the wisdom of Pythagoras and Euclid. But even this isn't a complete explanation, for it is almost impossible to determine how this tremendous job was done. The idea that we have is far too trite. They thought that perhaps they were simply built as a result of slave labor in Egypt will not hold water. It is simply not sufficient. The amount of work that is involved in those monuments simply transcends imagination. Also, they require a skill and a group of instrumental aids, which we do not believe that antiquity possessed. So a great many persons long ago in Alexandria, and more recently right here now, have fallen back upon this supernatural hypothesis. When we can't imagine how a thing was done, we begin to believe that it must have been done by magic or some supernatural power or force. The Chinese have long believed that their Great Wall was built by the gods. They did not believe that any human being could build it. And it is only natural when we come into the presence of something that transcends our own abilities that we begin to wonder whether some strange esoteric means was involved, as in the case of the statues on Easter Island and many other such unsolved mysteries of antiquity. To fall back upon this supernatural theory is comforting to a degree, but it can lead us into serious complications, because we know that the Egyptians and other nations of that period were esotericists. We know that they had a knowledge of natural law far ahead of their time, and they had a responsibility for the use of natural law far ahead of our time. These people had a deep appreciation for the immensity and integrity of the universal plan. They had already discovered thousands of years ago that you cannot break natural law without suffering. They had never developed that strange type of egotism which impels us often to assume that God is depending upon us to take care of his purposes and plans. They did not think this. They realized or believed that they were the servants of an infinite reality. And now, all these casing stones have disappeared except 6. There are 6 stones left that to remind us of what was originally the entire facing of the building. These stones are huge, weigh hundreds, maybe thousands of pounds, and they are still in place, but that's all there is of them. All the rest of God. Now we are told that they probably were used to build various structures in the city of Cairo, that they were used to create palaces and mosques for the Muslims, and that little by little the Great Pyramid was turned into a quarry to be the source of base materials for building purposes. This answers one question, however, that we have to consider. There are some marks on the sides of the pyramid, considerable distance from the ground, which have been believed to mark water erosion, and the idea that the pyramid was at some time or other submerged, up at least 2/3 of the way. If Mamun's statements can be believed, this is not possible. Also, it is more likely that these markings, these marks that look like water erosions, are actually sand erosions that were the result of sand blowing against the walls after the capping stones and facing stones had been removed. So the probabilities of the so-called antediluvian date remains speculative. We do not know. One thing is probably inevitable, that whoever built the pyramid had a very great knowledge and presumably was wiser than most of the peoples in the world today. We know, when I was in Egypt, I talked to a French architect who was standing alongside me at the foot of the Great Pyramid. And he said, if this building had not survived, if the modern world had had nothing in the form of knowledge except reports about it, and the building had not continued to exist, there isn't a soul on earth who would believe that it had ever been built. And this is more or less the situation. The only reason we have to accept it is because it's there. And the more we study it, the less we know about it. Now, the modern researchers have found in the pressure spaces above the king's chamber some markings which are assumed to be part of the inscription of the pharaoh Cheops, that this cartouche of Cheops. But when you see the cartouche photographed, it's hard to get to look at the actual one. The condition is so dim and so faint that there may be very grave doubt as to whether Cheops had anything to do with it at all. In the first place, a proud pharaoh wishing to mark a building as a proof of his own skills would not have placed those inscriptions in a position where they could never be read, never could be seen, and in the process of completing the building were most of them mutilated or completely obliterated. Therefore, it is not at all likely that the proud pharaoh put something in those chambers that could not be found for thousands of years, and then only by accident. Most of the Egyptian monuments are clearly marked with the cartouches of their originators. Some of them also have taken off an earlier cartouche and put their own in its place, the cartouche being an oval lozenger containing the name of the pharaoh. So the Cheops theory is pretty weak, although it is still clung to for lack of a better one. And I think the real thing we have to go into in studying this is to find out, if we can, what the actual meaning of the building is, why it was put where it is, why other buildings and the Sphinx are in the same and particular relationship to each other. Some of the more thoughtful progressives have come to the possible conclusion that the Great Pyramid was part of a great calendar system, that by means of it, it was possible to calculate most of the important phenomena of astronomy. The ancients did not have telescopes as we know them, but they did have ways of calculating mathematically the various positions of planets and the precession of the equinoxes. And it's been suggested that the Great Pyramid and its immediate surrounding structures was a tremendous calendar structure, perhaps the oldest known to man. This is not unreasonable if we think about it. We know that one of the pyramids in Yucatan, in Chichen Itza, was an observatory, the parts of which still remain and we know that it was an observatory. There are also other indications. The great ziggurats of Babylonia and Chaldea were towers for stargazing. They were where the ancient Chaldeans studied the heavens year after year, century after century. And according to Budge of the British Museum, many of these studies and calculations were carried on for 10 or 20,000 years. One thing that comes to mind then in connection with this whole situation is that we may have to revise our understanding of what antiquity was like. Perhaps we cannot assume that we have gradually arisen from a completely barbarian state, and that in a few thousand years behind our present culture there was nothing but a colossal ignorance. this concept will not hold. Somewhere along the way, there were tremendous minds, a great body of knowledge that was capable of planning and executing unbelievable works of skill, beauty, and wisdom. The Egyptians themselves were of the opinion that at a remote time the gods had been with men, that deities and divine powers walked the earth. Now, this again may be regarded as symbolical. Perhaps what they were trying to tell us is that in a remote time long ago, the human being was naturally mystical, naturally had the power of extrasensory perception, naturally could communicate or understand, estimate, or react to the divine principles upon which the universe was based. That the gods walking with men merely meant that the God power in man was not obscured as it is now. That gradually over a course of time, the material world has taken over. The ancient peoples had a very simple physical existence comparatively. There was no problem of population, no intensive competition in trade, and wars were comparatively limited to a few swashbuckling militarists. The people in general lived a very quiet and a natural life, completely dependent upon their insights into universal laws. Just as the American Indian, without any assistance from the outside, not only developed a profound mysticism, but evolved from within himself practically every law, rule, and principle necessary to the government of his affairs. The Great League of the Iroquois was probably one of the most important movements of international peace that the world ever knew. And yet it was developed and perfected by Indians sitting under trees, wrapped in skins of animals and with feathers in their hair. And yet these people, intuitively and internally, had a tremendous depth of insight. This depth of insight has been lost as the result of the individual being subjected to continual external conditioning. He is taught from childhood not to think for himself, not to search within himself for the answers to his problems, but to read them out of books and have them conferred upon him by physical educational processes. As a result of that, he has lost the power of direct contact with realities. His new philosophy, if you could call it such, is built entirely upon the opinions of his contemporaries and the interpretations by these contemporaries of earlier documents and beliefs. If we assume that the individual was a source of almost complete knowledge, that he had the skills and the abilities to intuit nearly everything necessary to his own survival, it is then quite probable that we are gradually going to learn that the leaders of this intuitive procedure were parts of a great sacerdotal group. You might be willing to call them the mysterious sages, the wise men of ancient times, the first ones of the earth who knew, and the giants of mind and thought who were upon the earth in those days. In any event, however, there was undoubtedly a tradition that descended into Egypt from a still earlier source, a tradition based upon an internal development of spiritual resources, a development which went back perhaps to India or to one of the ancient civilizations that have now vanished away. But by 4,000 or 5,000 or even 10,000 BC, there was a great knowledge in the hands or in the keeping of a few persons. And these few persons more or less set up the system of mysteries which operated in Egypt, Greece, and the Roman Empire. Now in this also, I think it is very important to bear in mind that the initiate system which was the prevailing system in Egypt at that time, was based upon one tremendous point, a point which we have lost, a point which we have never really attempted to restore, but about which we have given considerable thought and consideration. The purposes of the mysteries, according to such initiates as Plotinus, Proclus, Iamblichus, Ammonius Saccas, and others, was very simple, that the individual should learn factually, truly, beyond question, beyond doubt, through personal experience, that death is an illusion. That immortality is the summit of man's problem. That the ancients not only believed in it, but kept this belief in secret, but developed a science by means of which they could communicate the fact and example and circumstance of death directly to another person. Recently, in Java, on Indonesia, a restoration process has been used on the Great Pyramid at Jakarta, known now as the Borobudur. This great Buddhist monument is another one of those mysteries. It is a pyramid. It is a perfect pyramid in a sense, but it represents a different philosophy of life. Therefore, it is presented with somewhat modified symbolism. Up to about 25, 30 years ago, this great monument, which is probably one of the largest religious structures on earth, was gradually fading away. The rock from which it was composed was weathering out of existence. The lack of adequate foundation was undermining its stability, and suddenly the world decided something should be done about it. So UNESCO started a program for the restoration of the Borobudur. And the job has been very, very well done at expense of many millions of dollars. But this great religious monument now stands as it was originally intended to stand. It is a pyramid that rises up through 7 levels, much like the ziggurat of Babylon and Chaldea. The upper or apex part of the pyramid of the Borobudur was a pagoda-like stupa or a reliquary with 2 rooms in it, which was empty. The restoration of it has never been able to find anything for that empty room. The building builds up to a symbol and then ceases. And this is the same thing that happens in the pyramid. The capstone of the pyramid is missing. The sacred relic that was supposed to be in the capstone or head of the Borobudur is also missing. So that all these things represent a certain unfinishedness, and it reminds us perhaps that in natural law and in the reactions within our own natures, everything that belongs to the material world is unfinished. Existence, mortal existence, is an unfinished business, and it takes place in an unfinished world and challenges everything that lives here with the restrictions of an unfinished realization of truth. Everything is growing, but nothing has completed its growth. Everything is getting better, but nothing in the mortal world has finally achieved the state of being best. Everything we try to do, everything we try to work with, science particularly, should have a complete understanding of the mystery of the missing capstone, because science is worrying over it right at the moment, but on a different level of thought. Everything that science discovers leads somewhere, but when it just about gets to the point where it looks as though it might tell us a great truth, it fades away. All visible things, if you trace them upward to their highest conditions, disappear. All of the intellectual achievements of the individual or of the great system of learning, this ascends from one level of genius to another, but the supreme genius has never been reached. The supreme answer to the problem of life has never been reached. All that we have for these particular conclusions is our own inward realization. So the formula is rather simple. We can build everything on the outside up to a point, but to complete it we must call entirely upon the inside. It is our own inner life that must perfect every structure that is formed in the material world. The answer to everything lies in ourselves. We can read books up to a certain point. We can use laboratory experiments up to a certain point. But somewhere along the line, as the alchemists learned, and they studied from the Alexandrian savants, these alchemists learned that the final ingredient of the transmutation was man himself, the internal part of his own nature. His own soul had to transform base metals into gold. Each individual soul must perfect the structure of his life, otherwise it will never be perfected. So to account for this, nearly every monument of importance in the world either has the top part missing or a bad scar in it, something imperfect, something that represents a flaw in the original purpose, because the completion of it must always depend upon the consciousness of the person beholding it. Otherwise, the secret cannot be perfected.